So not only is the absence of speaking to it, I think the second challenge is we went through a period of time where the church decided it was going to legislate morality and chastity without providing a proper biblical understanding of sexuality. So we wanted to impose restrictions and controls. Here's the truth. Rules and commandments that are enforced outside of relationship and responsibility will always damage people. If you try to impose, legislate, and control, and you have no relationship and you have no responsibility, it will always lead towards destruction. So I love the fact that we're living in a day where there's more of an openness within communicators within the church world, and people are a little more comfortable to talk about the fact, because friends, sexuality, our sexual identity, this is a gift to us from God. We are the ones who walk in the truth, not in the darkness, not in the false, and we should be the ones speaking about the right expression rather than being moved by the pressure of our society. So we need to break the silence. We were talking about this as our staff, the communicators, this week. Here's one of the sobering statistics. Girls are reaching puberty between the age of 8 and 10 right now. So they're already coming into a period of their life where they begin to understand and experience and express, and no one's talking to them. And so what's going to happen? They're going to be informed from external sources if we are not the ones that are helping them understand. Preteens and teens, man, I feel for them today. They are inundated in a culture that encourages sexual exploration with no embarrassment, no rules, and no guilt and no shame. So they have to live inside of this pressure, and they see it. And if we don't speak to it or we don't provide a relationship around it, they will misunderstand and they will walk away from the power that God's given us. Young adults, think about this truth. Young adults are living at home longer, they marry later, and then they're left to manage the tension of their sexuality and their identity in a culture that advocates promiscuity, self-indulgence, and sexual freedom. And we all know that to be true. If you're a parent today, you know, you thought you sent them off to college and then you welcomed them back home again. Then you sent them off to their first house and then you welcomed them back home again. And some of you are still waiting to send them back out again. But as the age increases and marriage gets pushed later and later and later, that does not mitigate the tension of sexuality that they have to wrestle through. Am I making sense in the room? You hearing that? All right. So I think we come back to this and we have to understand when Paul speaks, I'm going to show you why. God created you as a sexual being. And when you realize what he does for us and how we can live, this is a powerful, powerful truth that's so liberating. All right, back in your notes. Let's go to number 2 this morning. Here's what, for Paul. Paul, it was imperative that these Christian believers living in Asia Minor understand. Write this down. Evil destroyed the innocence of your sexuality. Evil destroyed the innocence of your sexuality. Paul wanted these believers to understand what it means to be an imitator of God, not only by what they should do, but by what they must stop doing. It was because of evil that their sexuality, their innocence, their respect, their dignity, and the honor of this relationship and marriage was lost. If you go back and you look in your notes, I want you to look at verses 3 and 4. Paul starts with this word, but. He says, but among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or any kind of impurity or greed, because these are improper for God's holy people. Nor should there be obscenity, foolish talk, or coarse joking, which are out of place. Why was he so strong on this issue? Because Paul understood something. That the brokenness of humanity had permeated to the very depths of our sexuality, so much so that we are comfortable degrading, dehumanizing, and objectifying people. We use rather than give to people. We take rather than give back and build up from people. So Paul says you have to understand something. When you were in darkness, you didn't see this. Now that you're in the light of Christ, you need to realize that evil destroyed the innocence of your sexuality. So you need to stop participating in things that actually continue to propagate the evil and the work of evil that has been done in this world today, and what sin is running rampant through this. You go back into Genesis and you look what took place with the serpent and Eve. Now let's be clear. Sex was not original sin. That's not what we're talking about here. But the serpent came along to Eve, tempted Eve, and Eve gave into the temptation and through disobedience ate of the fruit of the tree in the center of the garden. Then she goes along to Adam and goes, hey, check this out. It's pretty good fruit. Adam goes, yeah, I'm going to take some too. Both of them, willful disobedience, sin, and they fall in their sin. But one of the secondary results of sin, of their disobedience, His innocence was lost. Genesis 3, verse 7, here's what it says. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were, what's that word? Naked. Naked. God had created them as sexual beings, and in innocence, honor, relationship, and respect gave them freedom in which to enjoy their life. Communion with the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, communion and relationship with each other, enjoying the greatest levels of intimacy that man would ever know. And through disobedience and sin, all of a sudden, we have brokenness and awareness. And they go, we're naked. And they try to cover themselves. And the covering of their physical bodies was even greater for the covering of the sin that took place in their life. Sin always takes away. It never gives back. It always takes away. You know, if you look at Paul's description of the life of the Roman Empire, it was graphic and it was dismal. Sexual immorality, impurity, greed, polygamy, adultery, homosexuality, incest, obscenity, foolish talking, coarse joking. Prostitution was legalized. Temple prostitution was ritualized. Paul used a very, very unique word. He tried to describe sort of the entire gamut of what was taking place in their cultural context. He used a word, it was called porneia, to describe what was happening here. It's an all-encompassing word to describe all forms of inappropriate sexual activity outside the bonds of marriage. He goes, it doesn't matter what it is. It all fits in. It's all-encompassing. He goes, and you shouldn't be doing that because your designer, the one who created you, gives you the proper expression. And he could tell you, he knows where the damage is going to come. But Rome's prevailing moral code had all but decimated any trace of man's sexual innocence. Excess and indulgence ruled the day. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Sexuality, family, and intimacy, as designed by God, were actually on the endangered list. If you want to see a little snapshot of what I'm talking about, because you're listening to me, let's go back and actually have a picture that Paul paints of Rome. Go to Romans 1:24-25. It'll be in your notes or on the screen. So God says, because of their situation, he gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator. God said the darkness and the destruction of evil was so prevalent and overwhelming that he said their appetite was so consuming that he couldn't even turn their heart back. And so he gives them over. And when you allow human sexuality into its most broken state, it will consume whatever it can. When innocence is lost and darkness prevails, sin will permeate the most innocent of relationships. Sexual appetite will be rooted in greed for objectifying people, voracious appetite for carnal gratification, and it will leave a trail of indulgence, abuse, brokenness, isolation, and despair. Does that not sound like a world we're living in today? Does that sound like something that we deal with when we open up? We open up the newspaper, we turn on the radio, we watch our TV sets. I think if you consider Rome, first century Rome, the way Paul describes it, the way the Bible describes it, it would make some of our red light districts blush with embarrassment. It was that serious. Now, the big lie of our culture, you know, we're living 2,000 years removed now. And we go, well, we're enlightened. We're so much better. We have better teachers. We have better understanding. We've got science on our side. We have education on our side. They were living back in the dark ages. It was even pre-medieval. I mean, how could they even know any better? Here's the big lie of our culture. Sex and sexuality is all about me. It's all about me. I have the right to define my sexuality. I have the right to express my sexuality as I choose. Sexuality is relative. If it's not hurting me, then it doesn't matter what I do. Leave me alone. That's the lie of our culture, that it's always about me. Here's the truth. We already know it's broken. We just don't want to admit it. We already know it's broken. We know that innocence is lost. We know sexual abuse, trafficking, and sex crimes are on the increase. We know that pornography in its addictive form has addicted more men, women, and now children are entrapped. Legislation is pending to legalize prostitution in Canada. So you see what takes place within our culture. The tension that we feel is that the undertow, the sexual tide of our culture is so strong that we cannot resist it. And friends, it's like a tsunami wave that's coming in. The evil that is part of what is taking place. And we need to speak and stand strong and be true to what God has called us to. See, sexuality is about gratitude, not gratification. Sexuality is about appreciation, not about our appetite. Now look in your notes. If your Bibles are still open, look at verse 4, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 4. Paul lists all these things that we shouldn't do. He said there should not be a hint of sexual immorality and impurity. And he lists all these things. And he uses this little word in there. He goes, but there should be thanksgiving. Thanksgiving. And in the middle of two lists of descriptive words, he drops this one thought that if you really understand who you are in Christ, your sexuality and your identity is all about appreciation and thanksgiving. You should enjoy how God has created you, and you should learn not to objectify, but how to build up, honor, and encourage one another. That in marriage, in the proper boundaries of sexual expression, that you would lift up and esteem one another. And it's something that is to be privileged and to be enjoyed. You know, we were talking about this the other day, but it reminds me of, churches will often put on marriage seminars just to help people with their marriages, and it's a good thing to do. We did one a year ago. And I remember the story, one marriage seminar, the presenter was at the front, and he had all these couples in the room. And of course, you've got newly married couples, and you've got couples that have been married 10, 15 years, and they got young kids. You have older couples in the room, and he thought, well, how do I create kind of an identity in the room? So I know, I'm going to ask him a little question. He goes, so let's talk about the frequency of sexual intimacy. So you're all married couples, everybody was okay. So he said, so let's just talk about it. How many of you would be, candid enough to tell me that, you have sexual intimacy 4 times a week? And, the young ones were like, oh yeah, we're up. And their hands are shot in the air. And he goes, oh, that's good. But he noticed there were a lot of hands were down still. And he goes, well, all right, so how many of you, maybe not 4 times a week, how many maybe 4 times a month? Oh, a lot more hands go up. And he goes, okay, so kind of once a week. And he goes, well, there's still some of you that haven't responded. How many of you would say 4 times a year? Some more hands go up. He says, wow. And he goes, well, I know some did. And he goes, is there anyone here that maybe just like once a year and in the room, one little hand goes up at the back, and the guy's like, me! And he's like just so excited to answer the question. The presenter's a little thrown off by that. He goes, this is awkward. I wasn't quite expecting that response. And he goes, I appreciate your candid response. He goes, well, why are you smiling and so happy if it's only 1 time a year? And he goes, tonight's the night! See, that's the deal. Our sexuality is about appreciation, not appetite. I hope that's not you that raised your hand this morning. But anyhow, that's where we're at. So when you look at this, you realize that this is what God has called us to, that He created us, He designed us, He understands what our expression needs to be. So go back into your notes, and I want you to